Anyways, the next talk will be by Anne, who you might probably all know. Her husband was prosecuted because he had access to a library, and he was sort of intellectual. He had knowledge, and you probably have read all these formulations, the things they suggested. But this talk will actually not be very much about him. It will be about other cases all over the world, where similarly terrorist laws have been applied to prosecute innocent citizens, or basically drastically misused. And this misuse is quite a danger for society, I think. And I guess this will be very interesting, because I don't think much has been publicized on that yet. So I hope you enjoy the talk, and please clear the pathways. That'd be very, very great. Anyways, have fun.
Hi, and thank you all for coming, and please don't pose any further security threats. We'll be talking enough about other dangers for security today. Maybe some of you saw me here last year when I talked about the case against André Holm, who's not my husband but my partner, which doesn't really make much of a difference. Last year I was quite shocked about having experienced such an arrest in the family and a terrorism charge, and by now I'm not much less shocked but slightly used to the fact. And in the course of the last year I have of course focused myself a lot on cases of terrorism. And in the time I noticed that there's many such cases, and I would like to introduce some of these to you today, because I think there's many others who are similarly strange and absurd in the way they are being run, and not all of them have so much public attention. I think that the public perception of what terrorism is generally goes along rather with what actually the current EU definition of terrorism is. This definition of 2002 says terrorism offenses are committed with the aim of seriously intimidating a population or unduly compelling a government or international organization to perform or abstain from performing an act, or seriously destabilizing or destroying the fundamental political, constitutional, economic or social structures of a country or an international organization. I think the general perception of terrorism is that involves massive violence against people, many deaths, and probably some kind of situation that creates danger for a government or a state in itself. The cases that I'm going to talk to you about don't fit that description very well, in my perception. I would like to say, though, that of course the information that I have about these cases is not complete. In most cases, the investigation is still going on. It's not quite clear what really happened, and still the investigation is running, and the files are generally not public, so I will tell you the best of what I know, but it may not be the complete information that we might find out about later when the cases will be closed eventually. I hope so. And of course, in cases like this, political views are involved, and there's often many different views, specifically differences between the prosecution and the defendants. And I will also, of course, leave out some of the details, because I will just give a basic overview of what is going on. The first case I would like to talk about is a case that took place in Nottingham, Great Britain, where on May 14th of this year, 2 members of the university were arrested under the Terrorism Act of 2000 of Great Britain. Their names are Hicham Yeza and Rizwan Sabir. And they were arrested because they had copies of the Al-Qaeda training manual on their computers, One of the two had downloaded this from the United States Department of Justice website. He's a member of the university's Politics and International Relations department. He was researching terrorism for his postgraduate studies. He was writing a PhD on the strategies of Al-Qaeda. He asked his friend and colleague Hicham, who is a former student and now works at the university, to help him with his PhD and specifically with printing out the huge document. Hicham, who used to be a member of the Senate of the Nottingham University, who is an editor of different magazines, now worked for the university in the administration, and both were arrested and held in police custody for 6 days before they were released without a charge. The charge, to begin with, was terrorism, like I said. It was then decided to not charge Hicham, who was mostly accused of the two, under the Terrorism Act. But when they were released after 6 days, he was rearrested for charges under the Immigration Act. It was also said later that if both had been maybe of Norwegian origin and maybe were blonde, then probably this wouldn't have been such a problem, but being of Arabic background, they completely fitted the stereotype of Muslim terrorists in the United Kingdom. He was rearrested under the Immigration Act, and an order for fast-track deportation was issued on May 23rd, and a deportation flight was scheduled for June 1st. This is 2 weeks after his first arrest. He had been in the UK for 13 years of residence and now had a planned deportation in less than 3 weeks after the arrest under the Terrorism Act. He was then moved around for 3 weeks from one immigration removal center to the next, and after a huge protest campaign, of which you can see one picture, which was quite impressive, I find, he was released on bail. As far as I know, the investigation concerning his possible problems with immigration laws is still going on. On the website of the campaign, there is no complete up-to-date information as to what the situation is now, but I found it rather striking that they were arrested to begin with. Rizwan, the one who had downloaded the manual, later said in an interview, "If they had just asked my professor why I was looking at this material, they would have understood that it was research. Instead, they chose to start an anti-terror investigation." What struck me in this case is a similarity to the case that we are as a family confronted with, which is that also here an academic is concerned, and a nice similarity is that there was a huge wave of support. The biggest demonstration ever that took place at the University of Nottingham was taking place for his support, and it is widely believed that this public support also helped to release and to drop the charges for terrorism. The next case I would like to talk about is a case that took place, or is actually still taking place, in Portugal. This is the British suspect. And the case in Portugal is a case against 150 activists who, in the August of 2007, destroyed a field of genetically modified corn plants of 1 hectare in size. This field is located in the region of Algarve, the first region in Portugal that was declared GMO-free by local authorities. It was the first time this kind of action was being carried out in Portugal. In other countries, this takes place more often, particularly in Germany. This kind of so-called mowing of GMO plant fields is actually quite common. It is considered more an action of civil disobedience, not necessarily by the owners of the fields, but by the activists. It is not considered a majorly violent action, but is tried to be seen as civil disobedience against something that is hard to protest against, which is genetically modified organisms being used now and endangering nature. This action took place during the day with press present, and until today there is a video online with a documentation of the action and reactions by the public, and especially the owner of the field. It is in no way what you would expect to be a terrorist action that is hidden in the dark, where it's impossible to identify anyone and impossible to really see what was going on. The video I find extremely interesting to see because it also includes many statements of the people who were involved. After this happened, there were strong reactions in the Portuguese media. The owner of the field received a visit by the Minister of Agriculture, by the Minister of Internal Affairs, who promised investigations, and by the President of the Portuguese Republic, who condemned the action and announced it must be punished. In September, the investigation went on. So far, there are no formal charges, but they are being threatened against the activists who don't really know what they will be facing, and the action was classified by the government as terrorism, and in result also by Europol, who is collecting and doing statistics on cases of terrorism in the European Union. Europol said that in other cases that are falling in these fields of so-called single-issue activities, terrorism cases are divided into left-wing terrorism, right-wing terrorism, Muslim fundamentalist terrorism, and then there's a so-called single-issue terrorism. And normally these cases of single-issue activities are declared to be extremist, but not terrorism. Portugal chose to have this, the first case to be investigated under the new Portuguese law against terrorism, to have their first case of terrorism also, and so the only case of terrorism in Portugal that is reported in the Europol report for 2007 is this case of 150 activists who during the day trampled across a cornfield. There's one other case which is of right-wing extremism, which is an entirely different matter, of course. This case doesn't really have much similarity to the case against André Holm, but basically it's a form of action. What that's maybe similar that, or vaguely similar that, is labeled terrorism, which normally is not that uncommon. It's the first time in Portugal that something like this happened, and it is quite obvious that the activists didn't expect this kind of reaction. They did not expect to be prosecuted as terrorists. And one could argue that the actions of the militant group, which is what André is still accused to be a member of, are also mostly symbolic actions. It's not violence against people, nobody was ever hurt. It's mostly paint bombs against, for example, unemployment agencies, cars being burned, or minor property damage. The next case I would like to talk about is a case that took place in Austria, also in May this year, when 10 people were arrested through armed police in Vienna. According to the Austrian paragraph 278A of the Austrian Penal Code, which is the law that punishes forming a criminal organization, which was introduced already in 1993. This is the only case that doesn't directly involve terrorism, but has many similarities nonetheless. 23 apartments, houses and offices were searched, doors were kicked in by masked officers with weapons drawn. And the cause for the arrests were called the danger of suppression of evidence and the danger of committing a crime. Suppression of evidence was seen as a danger because some of the suspects had used encryption and might do so again. Danger of committing a crime was seen in the fact that some of the suspects had been politically active around issues of animal rights or animal protection. There is not visible any clear evidence that the suspects were actually involved in the attacks that they were accused of, and these attacks are the first strong case they were accused of having participated in was an assumed arson attack against a hunting lodge. And in fact, it was found out later that this was caused by an oven of this lodge, which didn't work properly. And the other things that are left in the investigation now are mostly things like broken windows or glue in some door locks, graffiti, sabotaged deer stands. They were accused of sabotage of animal hunting, and in fact what happened was that people made noise during animal hunting, and this is a sabotage. Also, there were several stink bombs against fur-selling stores. All 10 activists openly admit that they are engaged in either animal rights groups or animal protection groups, and that's an interesting thing also. They are accused of being a criminal organization 10 people, but the 10 people that were arrested are part of two very different groups who actually don't like each other very much for ideological reasons. One are the more, you might say, radical animal rights activists, and the other is the